Usually, when a nation calls its citizens to arms, the initial assessment is, purely physical.
Right. It's highly clinical.
Exactly. It's like engineering. You stand in a line, a doctor checks your vision, listens to your heart, maybe looks to see if you have flat feet.
Yeah, it's a binary equation, fit for duty or not fit for duty.
Right. The criteria are visible, they're measurable, and standardized.
And it provides a comforting illusion of control, for a massive bureaucracy. A mobilization system likes things that can be categorized by, well, biology and medical science.
Sure, because a heart murmur is an objective fact.
Exactly. A missing index finger is an objective fact. You can build spreadsheets and logistical pipelines based on those very tangible realities.
But then you step into the world of conscientious objection, and suddenly that entire measuring tape is just, well, it's rendered completely useless.
Yeah, it really is.
We are no longer looking at physical health. We are looking at a diagnostic landscape that is entirely murky. You're asking a sprawling, unfeeling government apparatus to somehow, measure a person's soul.
Right.
To verify their deepest, most invisible internal convictions.
This is the ultimate administrative nightmare.
Yeah.
How do you quantify a belief?
Good question.
And more importantly, how do you do it when the stakes are quite literally the survival of the nation?
Yeah, it's heavy. And welcome to our deep dive. I'm so glad you're joining us today because the framework we are unpacking dives straight into the center of that nightmare.
It really does. We have an incredibly dense single-source text today, an excerpt titled Managing Conscientious Objection in National Mobilization Systems.
And our mission for this deep dive is to meticulously unpack this framework. We're examining exactly how modern democracies handle citizens who look the state in the eye during a massive existential mobilization and say, no. I refuse to fight. Okay, let's unpack this. The whole text relies on this foundational triad. It's essentially a three-legged stool that the state is desperately trying to balance on during a total war scenario.
Yeah, balancing is the key word there.
Managing conscientious objectors requires keeping three completely distinct, heavily weighted forces in equilibrium. First, you have the state's desperate demand for manpower.
Right, obviously.
Second, you have the state's legal and moral obligations to uphold human rights.
Yes.
And third, the preservation of public morale.
And if you look closely at those three pillars, the inherent contradiction becomes really obvious. It is a terrifying paradox for a democracy.
How so?
Well, think about the nature of total mobilization, right? It demands absolute collective sacrifice.
Yeah.
Every resource, every factory, every human life is theoretically subordinated to the goal of national survival.
Okay, sure.
So how does a nation in that extreme posture simultaneously respect an individual's right to refuse participation based on a personal moral code?
It seems impossible. If manpower is your absolute priority, then the human rights just become like a logistical obstacle.
Precisely the danger. And conversely, if you prioritize individual human rights to the point where anyone can simply opt out by claiming a moral objection, well, your manpower pipeline dries up.
Wow, yeah.
And if either of those pillars falters, that third leg, public morale, collapses entirely. A democracy cannot fight a war if the public believes the burden of fighting is being distributed unfairly.
Right. Or if they believe the government has just turned into a tyrannical machine that crushes the conscience of its own citizens.
Exactly.
So the documentation we were reviewing today offers a solution, though I wouldn't call it a warm or comforting one.
No, definitely not.
It details a highly structured, tiered system of assessment, alternative service, and legal enforcement. And while the language used in these frameworks is exceptionally dry and bureaucratic, what it actually describes is a high-stakes, ruthless game of psychological and societal engineering.
It's intense.
It's like the state is trying to thread a needle while wearing boxing gloves.
That's a great way to put it. And, bureaucratic language is often deployed as an anesthetic. It masks the raw human friction of what is actually happening on the ground.
Yeah, like what?
Well, when a document talks about, quote, appellate review processes, it is really talking about a terrified 22-year-old sitting in a room trying to explain the contents of their soul to a panel of strangers who have the power to throw them in prison.
Oof. Yeah, let's start with those strangers in that room. Because to balance that precarious triad, the state first has to figure out who is actually telling the truth.
Right.
If you step out of the mobilization line and claim your conscience forbids you from fighting, the state needs a mechanism to determine if you are being honest. This framework relies on statutory assessment tribunals, specifically what they call local and appellate review boards.
The defining characteristic of these boards, and this is a really critical design choice by the state, is that they are explicitly set up as independent, quasi-judicial civilian tribunals. Yes, we really have to pause on the word civilian because it does a massive amount of heavy lifting in this system.
But wait, if the military needs soldiers, why wouldn't the military just run the boards? Like, why not have a panel of generals or recruitment officers evaluate these objectors?
Because the military's singular mandate is to generate combat power.
Right.
If you put a panel of colonels in charge of evaluating a pacifist, the public perception will immediately curdle. The outcome feels completely predetermined.
Oh, I see.
If a uniform is sitting across the table, judging your objection to war, that public morale leg of our triad starts to buckle. It just looks like a kangaroo court designed to feed the meat grinder.
So by making it a civilian board, the state is projecting fairness.
Exactly. It signals to the public and to the objector that the evaluation is being conducted by peers, by society itself, rather than the war machine.
Like a jury, almost.
Yeah. You're being judged by the local baker, a retired school teacher, maybe a civil magistrate. It creates a buffer of democratic legitimacy.
I have to challenge the effectiveness of that, though. I mean, even if the board is made up of well-meaning civilians, how do they legally or practically prove what's in someone's heart?
That's the million-dollar question.
You can't perform a blood test for pacifism. The framework says the boards must determine if the objection is rooted in, quote, genuine moral, philosophical, or religious conviction, as opposed to draft evasion. How do you measure genuine?
That is the central agony of the tribunal process. You cannot measure it perfectly. You are essentially asking a local committee to conduct an epistemological audit of another human being.
An epistemological audit, wow.
Yeah, and to do this, they rely on consistency and historical behavior. They look for evidence that this belief system wasn't just adopted yesterday when the draft notice arrived in the mail.
So they are looking for a paper trail of a person's beliefs.
Historically, yes. In older mobilization models, the state only recognized one very specific basket of belief, which was religious conviction. Faith-based pacifism.
Okay, like the Quakers.
Exactly. If you belong to a recognized historic peace church like the Quakers or the Mennonites, you brought a letter from your congregation leader, and the bureaucracy was satisfied. They had their stamp, you had your recognized category.
But modern democracies have had to expand beyond just religious institutions, haven't they? I mean, the framework specifically lists moral and philosophical alongside religious.
They have. Modern legal frameworks in secular democracies simply cannot privilege one religious sect over the deeply held secular beliefs of another citizen. That violates equal protection under the law.
Right, that makes total sense.
So they introduce moral conviction. This refers to a deeply personal secular ethics system. An individual might not believe in any deity, but they hold a visceral, bone-deep conviction that taking another human life is universally wrong under all circumstances.
But that feels incredibly hard to prove. Like, if I don't go to a Quaker meeting every Sunday, how do I prove my secular moral conviction to a panel of school teachers?
It creates an intense bias toward the eloquent.
Oh, interesting.
The board might ask hypothetical questions, right? Like, what would you do if an intruder broke into your house and threatened your family?
The classic trick question.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you are a university-educated philosophy student, you might be able to articulate a nuanced defense of nonviolent resistance.
Right.
But if you were a young factory worker who just have a profound gut-level revulsion to killing, but you stumble over your words or get angry at the board's probing well, you might be classified as a draft evader.
That is terrifying. It means your survival depends entirely on your rhetorical skills under pressure.
Yes.
What about the third category they list, philosophical conviction? How does a mobilization system differentiate that from a moral objection?
A moral objection is usually anchored in the act of violence itself,
Okay.
the revulsion to killing. A philosophical conviction points toward a broader structural ideology.
Like what?
It might be a reasoned, systemic belief that war itself is an illegitimate tool of statecraft. Or it might be a political philosophy that views all national borders as artificial, making the defense of those borders through violence fundamentally absurd to the objector.
But regardless of whether you claim a moral, philosophical, or religious root, the state doesn't actually seem to care which one it is. The framework treats them all as equal inputs.
The state is entirely agnostic about the source of your pacifism.
Right.
The tribunal's only true mandate is to weed out what the state views as parasites. The draft evaders, the people who are motivated by cowardice laziness, or simple self-preservation.
Wow.
The state needs to isolate those who genuinely cannot participate due to conscience from those who simply do not want to participate because it is dangerous.
It is a profound stress test for a citizen. But let's assume an individual navigates this gauntlet. They sit before the civilian tribunal, they articulate their deeply held convictions, they survive the hypothetical scenarios about home intruders, and the board finally concludes, yes, this person has a genuine conviction. The state doesn't just hand them an exemption certificate and let them go back to their civilian life, do they?
Far from it.
Uh-huh.
That brings the manpower requirement roaring back to the forefront. The state has acknowledged your conscience, but it still views you as a critical resource. During total mobilization, no one gets to just sit out.
Right. And this is where the framework introduces a fascinating, highly granular categorization system. Once the tribunal validates the objector, they sort them into one of three distinct classes.
Yes.
It's basically an attempt to find the exact boundary line of an individual's conscience and exploit their labor right up to that edge.
It is a really precise sorting mechanism. The state asks, where exactly do you draw the line? Because we're going to put you to work 1 inch behind that line.
Wow. Okay, let's walk through these. Class 1 is designated as non-combatant military. The framework details this as individuals whose conscience forbids them from inflicting violence, but who are willing to operate within the military apparatus.
These individuals are willing to put on the uniform of the armed forces. They are willing to subject themselves to the military chain of command, to military discipline, and crucially, they are willing to deploy into the theater of war.
Okay, so they're in it.
Yes, they simply refuse to be the instrument of kinetic destruction.
The analogy that jumps out to me is a sports team. It's like being on the football team, traveling to all the away games, standing on the sidelines wearing the team colors, but refusing to ever tackle an opposing player.
That's a good way to look at it.
You accept the hierarchy and the shared risk, you just won't throw the punch. In a military context, what does that actually look like?
Well, it looks like the medical corps. It looked like unarmed logistics, communications, or quartermaster duties.
Ah, okay.
These are the individuals who will brave artillery fire to retrieve the wounded, but they will not carry a rifle to shoot back at the artillery position. They draw their moral line firmly at the act of pulling the trigger, but they do not view supporting the broader military structure as a violation of their soul.
It's a very specific ethical compromise. Like, I won't kill, but I will bandage the people who do kill.
Right.
That takes us to Class 2, which the framework calls conditional civilian. This category seems designed for someone who looks at that Class 1 compromise and finds it completely unacceptable.
Exactly. For the conditional civilian, the military uniform itself is a moral contaminant. Subjecting themselves to a military general's orders is a violation of their conscience.
Even if they aren't shooting.
Right. What's fascinating here is they believe that if they are, say, peeling potatoes in a military mess hall, they are feeling a soldier who will go shoot an enemy, which makes them complicit in the killing. The chain of command is the deal breaker.
But they still want to help the country.
Yes, they feel a profound civic duty to their neighbors, to their community, and to the survival of the nation, just not under the banner of the armed forces. They're willing to contribute their labor, but it must be completely segregated from the military apparatus.
The framework points them toward roles like agriculture, domestic infrastructure repair, or civil defense. They're essentially saying, I won't help you fight the war, but I will help ensure the civilian population doesn't starve or freeze in the dark while the war is happening.
And the state is more than happy to utilize that labor. Every conditional civilian who works a farm frees up an able-bodied citizen to be conscripted into the infantry.
Wow, yeah. Which brings us to the brick wall of this entire system, Class 3, the absolute or absolutist objector. The framework defines this group as individuals who refuse all forms of national direction or compulsory service connected to the war effort, whether military or civilian.
From the perspective of a state trying to manage a total mobilization, the absolutist is an organizational anomaly. They are the friction that cannot be lubricated.
Why is that exactly? If they refuse to join the military, but they also refuse to just grow wheat in a civilian farming program, what is their logic? Like, why won't they even farm?
Their logic is built on a tight, inescapable ethical loop regarding complicity. The absolutist understands the mechanics of a total war economy better than anyone.
Okay.
They argue that in a mobilized state, there is no such thing as purely civilian labor. If the government directs them to work on a civilian farm, they are producing food. That food feeds the nation, which allows the government to take another farmer, put a rifle in his hands, and send him to the front line.
So by filling the civilian gap, they are enabling the military machine to consume someone else.
Precisely. To the absolutist, obeying a state order to perform alternative civilian service is materially supporting the machinery of death.
That's intense.
They view the entire mobilization apparatus as a single, monstrous organism. You cannot feed one part of the organism without strengthening the teeth. Therefore, absolute purity of conscience demands absolute non-cooperation with the state's directives.
That is an incredibly heavy philosophical burden to carry. It leaves the state with almost zero leverage. But before we get to how the state handles those absolutists, we need to look closer at what happens to the people in Class 1 and Class 2.
The non-combatants and the conditional civilians.
Right. Because the framework outlines the actual architecture of their alternative service, and here's where it gets really interesting. It completely shatters the myth of the safe, cushy desk job.
It really does. The concept of alternative service is often misunderstood as a loophole for cowardice.
Yeah, that's the stereotype.
But the reality of how a mobilized state designs these roles is deeply revealing. The state must extract logistical value from these individuals, but it is simultaneously trying to balance that third vital leg of our triad public morale.
If the public thinks conscientious objectors are hiding out in comfortable administrative offices while their own sons are bleeding in trenches, society will tear itself apart. So the state engineers alternative service to be brutal.
It is a calculated distribution of risk. Let's look at the first category of service. The framework outlines auxiliary medical and emergency services.
Okay.
This involves forcefully positioning objectors in frontline trauma units, civilian emergency response, and disaster relief.
We really need to pause and think about the psychological reality of that assignment. I mean, these are individuals who have proven to a tribunal that they possess a deep, paralyzing moral aversion to violence.
Right.
And the state's response is to place them exactly where the most horrific, visceral consequences of violence are manifested.
It is a staggering demand on human endurance. The state is essentially telling the objector, you refuse to cause trauma. Fine. You will spend every waking hour of this war up to your elbows in the blood of those who did.
Wow.
You will drag shattered bodies out of the mud while artillery shells land around you. It requires a level of physical courage that is arguably equal to that of an infantryman, but it completely strips away the psychological defense mechanism of being able to fight back.
It's almost a punitive irony. But the state also needs to keep the home front operating.
Right.
The framework details vital domestic infrastructure as the next major category for alternative service. The rationale is to fill the labor shortages caused by massive military call-ups. We are talking about agriculture, power generation, transport networks, heavy manufacturing.
Because when a nation conscripts millions of citizens and sends them to a combat theater, the domestic economy, the very foundation that keeps the nation breathing, threatens to collapse overnight.
It makes me think of a massive high-stakes game of societal Tetris. The state reaches into a community and pulls out a civilian block, say a structural engineer or a train conductor, and ships them to the front lines.
Exactly.
That leaves a dangerous gap in the domestic structure. The state must perfectly slot a conscientious objector into that exact gap, otherwise the entire system crumbles.
Right.
You pull out a power plant operator to be a rifleman, you better have a conditional civilian ready to shovel coal into the furnace.
And we must emphasize that this is compulsory labor. The objector does not get to browse a job board and choose a career path that suits their interests.
No options.
None. If the state needs coal miners, the objector, regardless of their previous profession, is sent into the mines. It is the absolute suspension of individual autonomy in service to the collective.
But the most intense role the framework highlights under alternative service is civil protection and debris clearance. It specifies utilizing organized, non-military labor corps for post-strike clearing, firefighting in targeted urban centers, and unexploded ordnance management. Unexploded ordnance.
Yes.
Wait, really? They are making pacifists defuse bombs.
Yes, unexploded ordnance or UXO management. When a city is subjected to heavy aerial bombardment, a certain percentage of the munitions fail to detonate.
Why?
They bury themselves in the rubble of apartment buildings, streets, and factories. Someone has to dig them out and render them safe so the city can function.
That is terrifying. The state is essentially taking people who begged not to go to war and making them play Russian roulette with high explosives.
It is the ultimate manifestation of the state extracting a sweat and danger price. Remember the morale equation.
Right, the third leg of the stool.
The objector asks to be excused from the mortal danger of the battlefield. The state grants that request, but recognizes that if alternative service is completely safe, it will erode the fighting spirit of the combat troops. So the state actively designs alternative service to feature an equivalent level of physical peril.
It's a mechanism to prove their sincerity through suffering. If a pacifist is willing to walk up to a ticking 500-pound bomb in a burning neighborhood just to save civilian lives, no one in the military can credibly call them a coward.
It balances the ledger.
But everything we've discussed so far relies on compliance. We've seen how the state accommodates those willing to compromise, the ones who will drive the ambulances or defuse the bombs. But what happens to the absolutists?
The Class 3 individual.
Right, the ones who refuse to be a piece in the state's Tetris game. Or what about the people whose applications were completely rejected by the civilian tribunal, yet they still refused the draft?
That leads us into the grim machinery, detailed in the framework section on sanctions and enforcement.
Yeah, if you thought the state was being somewhat accommodating before by offering alternative roles, this is where the velvet glove comes off entirely. The state reveals its monopoly on force.
A mobilization system, by its very nature, cannot tolerate mass defiance. It relies on the absolute authority to compel action.
The framework outlines judicial prosecution as the immediate response. It states clearly that rejected applicants who refuse military service or recognized absolutists who refuse directed civilian service are prosecuted under military or emergency civil service acts. They are taken to court.
And the consequences are not a slap on the wrist.
No, the primary sanction listed is civilian incarceration. These individuals are sentenced to custodial sentences or penal labor. They are thrown in prison, often for the duration of the conflict, plus several years.
And we really need to analyze the specific, stated rationale for this incarceration within the framework. It is rarely framed as purely punitive or rehabilitative.
Okay, so why do they say they do it?
The documentation notes that incarceration is utilized, and this is a critical concept, to prevent mutiny or mass noncompliance from eroding frontline troop morale.
There is that third leg of the triad again, public and troop morale.
Exactly. The state is not locking up the absolutists because they pose a physical danger to society. A pacifist is not going to rob a bank or assault a neighbor.
Right, they're nonviolent.
The state is making a highly calculated, highly visible theatrical example of them. Put yourself in the boots of a frontline soldier. You are knee-deep in freezing mud, under constant artillery barrage, watching your friends die.
It's a nightmare.
If you hear a rumor that someone back home simply said, "My conscience forbids this," and was allowed to walk away and live a comfortable life without consequence, the psychological urge to throw down your own rifle and walk away becomes overwhelming.
Wow. So the state incarcerates the objector to keep the soldiers in the trenches from deserting. It is a psychological deterrent directed entirely at the military audience, paid for with the freedom of the pacifist.
It is a brutal utilitarian calculus. The state sacrifices the individual liberty of a few to maintain the structural integrity of the millions in arms.
But the sanctions go far beyond a prison sentence. And this is where the framework ventures into territory that should make any citizen of a democracy deeply uncomfortable. It details the loss of state benefits and rights.
This represents a fundamental rupture in modern understanding of the social contract.
The framework lists historical precedents like temporary or permanent disenfranchisement, forfeiture of eligibility for any public sector employment, and severe financial penalties. Let's focus on disenfranchisement for a second. Stripping away a citizen's right to vote.
I struggle to wrap my head around the philosophical paradox here.
Frame the paradox for us.
Okay. A modern democracy mobilizes to fight a total war, ostensibly to preserve its democratic ideals, its freedoms, and its way of life against an existential threat.
But to manage that mobilization, the state turns around and legally strips away a citizen's most fundamental democratic mechanism, the right to vote, simply because that citizen exercised their individual conscience. Doesn't that transform the democracy into the very tyranny it is claiming to fight?
This raises an important question, and you have hit the nerve center of the entire framework. Our peacetime, modern view of citizenship is that rights are inherent, inalienable, and guaranteed.
Yeah.
You were born with them or you naturalize, and they cannot be revoked simply because you disagree with a government policy.
Right. The Constitution doesn't say you have the right to vote unless we really need you to do something else.
But the documentation of total mobilization reveals a very different underlying reality. During an existential crisis, the state quietly redefines citizenship. It ceases to be an inherent status and becomes a transactional contract.
Wait, a transaction? So you're saying my citizenship isn't an identity, it's a lease agreement.
It is a lease agreement, where the payment terms radically change the moment the state is under threat. The logic of the mobilization state is this. The ultimate final price of the social contract is defending the state when it faces destruction.
Okay.
The state provides you with roads, schools, police, and a voting booth during peacetime. In return, when the state is attacked, you must provide your labor or your life.
And if you refuse?
If you refuse national service, even if that refusal is based on a deeply held, genuine moral conviction, you have breached your side of the contract. Therefore, the state feels legally and morally justified in suspending its obligations to you.
Wow.
You'll not fight to preserve the state, therefore you lose the right to vote on how the state is governed. You lose the right to be employed by the public sector that the state funds.
It's a chilling revelation. It strips away all the lofty rhetoric about unalienable rights and exposes a cold, hard truth. Under the extreme pressure of war, your rights as a citizen are strictly conditional upon your participation in the collective survival effort.
It is the ultimate expression of state survival overriding individual liberty.
Which perfectly transitions our exploration to the final and arguably most insidious aspect of this framework, the PR war.
Yes.
The state has to manage domestic morale and information with an iron grip, because putting pacifists in prison or taking away their right to vote isn't just an administrative task. It creates ripples in the public consciousness, and the state must control how the public interprets those ripples.
Absolutely. A mobilized state is deeply existentially afraid of resentment within its own borders.
The framework outlines depolarization strategies, and this points right back to those incredibly hazardous alternative service roles we discussed earlier, the bomb clearance, the frontline trauma units.
Right.
The documentation explicitly states these roles are chosen and publicized to, quote, mitigate accusations of cowardice or unfair burden sharing from the families of frontline soldiers.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, what the state is actively managing here is a socio-political concept known as blood equity.
Blood equity. Let's dig into that. How does the state define it?
Think of society during a war as operating on a massive, invisible ledger of sacrifice. The public is constantly, obsessively monitoring this ledger.
Okay, I'm following.
Let's imagine a neighborhood. A mother watches her son get drafted, put in a uniform, and shipped to a combat zone where he might be killed. She has given the state her most precious asset. She has made an immense deposit into the ledger of blood equity.
And naturally, she is going to look around at her neighbors to see what they are contributing.
Exactly. I imagine she looks next door. The neighbor's son claimed conscientious objection. If the state allows that neighbor's son to stay home, sleep in his own bed, and work a safe administrative job at the local municipality, the mother's resentment will be absolute and devastating.
She will view him as a parasite, benefiting from her own son's sacrifice without paying any cost himself.
It polarizes the community instantly. It destroys the foundational propaganda of any war effort, which is the narrative that we are all in this together, sharing the burden equally. The state cannot survive that kind of domestic fracturing.
So how does the state manipulate this organic human emotion?
By engineering visible suffering for the objector. If the mother looks next door and sees that the pacifist son is being forced to work 16-hour shifts, digging unexploded artillery shells out of collapsed buildings, risking his life every single day, well, the resentment is depolarized.
Wow.
She may still profoundly disagree with his pacifism. She may not like him. But she cannot look at him and say he isn't paying a terrifying price. The ledger of blood equity feels balanced. The state needs the objector to suffer visibly, and I make sure the public knows about it, precisely to keep the families of soldiers from turning against the government.
It is perception management on a massive, almost theatrical scale. But the state's control of the narrative goes far beyond just making the objectors look like they are suffering. The framework outlines a much more aggressive, authoritarian tactic regarding information: the containment of anti-war agitation.
This addresses the core vulnerability of a mobilization system. A conscientious objector is, by definition, an ideological threat to the premise of the war.
Right. The documentation states that governments will utilize public order decrees and sedition regulations to prevent organized objection movements from actively sabotaging mobilization efforts or running anti-conscription campaigns. The clinical nature of the word containment is striking.
It treats a philosophical belief like a highly contagious biological pathogen.
It really does. And it exposes the strict limits of a democracy's tolerance during wartime. The system will tolerate a solitary, quiet pacifist. If you sit in your house, hold your personal beliefs, pass your tribunal, and quietly go drive your assigned ambulance, the state will accommodate you.
But the very microsecond those individual pacifists attempt to organize.
They cross an invisible, heavily guarded line.
Yes.
The moment they print a pamphlet arguing the draft is immoral, or hold a public meeting in a town square, or try to convince other young people that the war is unjust, they cease being individual objects of conscience. They suddenly become a systemic, operational threat to the mobilization machine itself.
And how does the state respond to an operational threat? It does not engage them in a philosophical debate about the merits of nonviolence. It deploys the blunt instrument of sedition laws.
You are no longer viewed as an objector exercising free speech. You are labeled a traitor actively undermining national security.
The state recognizes that a mass mobilization is incredibly fragile on a psychological level. It requires a singular, overwhelming narrative of righteousness and inevitability to convince millions of people to walk into machine gun fire.
That makes sense.
If an organized group is permitted to loudly, publicly argue that the war is wrong and the draft is slavery, it provides a psychological permission structure for others to opt out. The state will use the full crushing force of its legal and police apparatus to silence that narrative before it can spread. Free speech is cordoned off and neutralized.
So what does this all mean? We have taken this incredibly dense, bureaucratic framework and pulled it apart piece by piece. And what we find underneath all the dry terminology is not just a set of administrative rules for handling people who don't want to fight. It's a blueprint of a colossal, unforgiving machine.
It is a machine designed with a single overriding purpose: national survival. Everything else, including individual conscience, is secondary.
The system portrays mobilization as an exhaustive administrative, legal, and psychological effort. It's a reminder that fighting a total war is not just about manufacturing tanks and sending soldiers to the front.
No, it's not.
It is an obsessive, all-consuming effort to categorize, utilize, extract value from, and sometimes ruthlessly punish every single human resource within the nation's borders, all while meticulously managing the volatile, dangerous emotions of the populace.
For anyone listening to this deep dive, the critical takeaway is understanding the cold, hard calculus of statecraft. In a peacetime democracy, we enjoy the luxury of elevating individual morality.
Right.
But during an existential crisis, the state constantly weighs that individual luxury against the collective, desperate need for survival. And in that brutal calculation, the state will always prioritize its own continued existence, bending, modifying, or outright suspending its democratic ideals to whatever shape is necessary to keep the war machine fueled and the home front pacified.
We started this deep dive by talking about the impossibility of measuring a person's soul, contrasting it with the simple clinical check of a physical draft assessment. The state tries to measure that soul with civilian tribunals, complex categorizations, and blood equity ledgers, but it is always an imperfect, messy approximation of justice.
An approximation heavily weighted in favor of the state's needs.
Always. I want to leave you, our listener, with a final thought to mull over on your own. Everything we've explored today, everything this framework outlines, focuses entirely on the state's perspective. It details the mechanisms of how the state views the objector, categorizes them, extracts labor from them, and contains them.
Right.
But I want you to try and flip the script completely. Imagine the perspective of the absolutist. Imagine sitting in that tribunal room, a lone individual facing the overwhelming power of the state apparatus.
It's a terrifying thought.
It is. When, with absolute, unshakable certainty that holding on to your deeply personal conviction means the state will legally take away your freedom, throw you in a penal labor camp, destroy your livelihood, and strip away your very right to exist as a voting citizen. What does it truly cost to stand your ground against the machinery of a national war?